Welcome back to the Real Kindness Games, everyone. We are here to shed light on our personal biases so that we can encourage kindness by modeling curiosity in conversation, so that we can we can appreciate another human for their unique perspective and heal our communities together
Did
as
you just
humans.
make that up?
I know, I'm like winging it,
That was
man. What's
different.
happening? I like stumbled a little. Uh,
Um,
well,
pew pews.
oh man, what's happening today? Everyone, welcome back to the Real Kindness Games. Pew, 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 pew. I feel like I need to not go back into the intro, but I will say this. As humans, we have far more in common than that what divides us. And that is why today we have Samira on our call. Samira, thank you so much for joining us today. Tim and I are crazy on our own, so we always like to have a third person to kind of, simmer us down. But please tell our viewers and listeners today a little bit about yourself, who you are, what makes you you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I know I've had some conversations with each of you one-on-one, and they've been a lot of fun. So thank you for bringing me into the craziness, I guess. As far as who I am, right? Like, think about that, who I am professionally, who I am personally. Maybe it's just a combination. I'm going to try not to separate it too much. So I am Samira Fazal Creole. I was born in Tanzania, but raised in Northern Virginia. Live in Richmond, Virginia now. I'm an IT professional. I'm in product management, and I've had a little bit of a crazy journey. I think some of it is trying to figure out who I am and what I want to do versus what I'm good at versus what my parents thought I should be doing and what I should be good at based on where I'm from and all those good things. But also just sort of I have a wonderful husband. I have two little girls. And I'm just sort of here trying to figure it all out for myself so that I can help them model, or be a role model to them so they don't have to do maybe quite so much figuring out on their way along their journeys.
So
I
important, right?
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love the fact that you have, I think it's like the American journey, right? Because the United States is filled of immigrants. Like, as a nation, we are, a nation of people who immigrated here. So I love your story, the fact that you were born in a different country and you came here and you've been here for so long and you're in the tech industry itself, which is so diverse yet not so diverse. So how have you managed some of your interactions with colleagues today versus some of your colleagues in the past, as our environment shifts?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think what's interesting is even sort of getting into the industry in itself, right? I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, like what I thought my parents wanted me to do. So interestingly enough, right, having sort of both a Middle Eastern and Asian background, what comes into most people's minds is, oh, you're either going to be a doctor or you must be in science or you must be a technologist. And then you take that a step further and you go, well, if you're in tech, you must be a coder or a tester, right? If you sort of visually look a certain way. And what's interesting for me is like, I'm in user experience and product management. So a lot of that is just trying to figure out, people's behaviors and where they're from and perspectives. And I would say, like when I first started my career 20 years ago, I almost stayed sort of more technical and less in the like people realm of things because that's where I was kind of supposed to be. I didn't really have that barrier to enter tech that a lot of people have, right? My parents encouraged education. They encouraged me to do what I wanted as long as it was math or science related, and that's great. But I also just had interests in, I used to love writing stories and being creative and take different languages and all that good stuff. But I kind of understood what they wanted me to do and veered in that direction. And I would say, years ago, I think it was hard even to see women in leadership roles in technology. The landscape has definitely changed. And I know for me personally, I often hesitated to go into that, women in tech movement, because again, in my head, it was more about a barrier to entry. But as I sort of navigated my own career and interacted with different people along the way, I realized that the actual problem is more of women hitting a certain level or sphere and then dropping out, right? And when you think about diversity in leadership, and I don't just mean like visually different, or even just gender differences, but what is your background, right? Is it all technology? Were you a sociology major? Were you a psychology major? Were you an English major? Like all of these things are much better. And I think that it's actually been nice to see the shift in more diverse teams from the standpoint of the makeup of where people come from, what they studied, who they are, where they live. All those different things are becoming better now. So I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's changed, but it's still a struggle from time to time, because I still get people assuming that I'm more technical than maybe I want to be anymore, simply because, hey, like visually being in technology, looking Asian, like I must be a coder, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes that can be a little frustrating.
I want to go back to the point that you just said, that things are shifting, right? Things are shifting in the technology industry, not just the tech world, but it's
Mhm.
really shifting in our professional side. And I think a lot of times people look at the negative side of things and they're like, oh, things aren't shifting fast enough. But it's like
Sure.
there is this shift. Would you be able to talk a little bit about what's caused this shift? Like why maybe 10, 15 years ago it was a different way, and like what actually made the shift happen?
Sure. So I think that, I'm a big proponent of design thinking methodologies. And oftentimes people say, right, there are 5 kind of like main characteristics of that. And at one point, and collaboration is one of those. And I think a long time ago, people would focus on collaboration with a bunch of the same people to solve a problem that they're having. And so I'll give you an example. If there was some sort of problem that a developer was having with a workforce tool that they were given, they would pull a bunch of developers in a room and try to figure it out. But over time, they've realized that you're so blindsided by what you do on a day-to-day basis that if you actually take an outside perspective, someone who isn't actually doing what you're doing, but can sit there and ask you like, well, what is it you're trying to accomplish? And you can look at things in a slightly different way. I may not do your job, but I can certainly empathize and hear pain points that maybe you're not even realizing you're having. So that whole concept of like that jobs to be done framework and things like
Hmm.
that, I think that along with this big sort of burst of innovation, and the fact that innovation really comes from, looking at and maybe repurposing things that you already have, or things that you're already doing in a slightly different manner, is really helpful. And I think that communication barrier gets broken down a little bit too, right? I also remember a
Yeah.
time where we had a development team and a finance team together. They're working on a platform, and the finance team is like, we need 0 defects. And the engineering teams are like, are you on crack? Like, that's just not right. That's not real. And then they came to find out that in the finance world, when they're saying we want 0 defects, they meant like 0 variance in the budget, right? So we need you guys to track your hourly, where are you, spending your time, because it's a billable thing. So 0 defects is no variance in the numbers. And, coders are like, well, you're freaking us out, because like 0 defects to us means perfect code. And that's just never going to happen. And so I think even that was very eye-opening to those 2 groups, right? And so I think that has sort of driven sort of more of this, let's talk, let's empathize a little bit more with each other. Let's really try to listen to what's going on, because we can help each other out more. And so I think that's where, I got to be honest, like, right, even if I go back to sort of growing up, the things that made me different scared me in the beginning, right? I kind of felt like, nope, I got to hide this part of me, because I need to assimilate. I need to be like other
Hmm.
people. But over time, and even in my career, I've learned that it's those differences that actually make me successful. And I shouldn't be
100%.
hiding that, right? So
Yeah.
I really love how you kind of showed that a lack of communication within 2 verticals of the same organization,
mhm,
right?
yeah.
Just a difference in perspective there. I'd love to hear more about how you kind of came to the US and grew up, and how those communication barriers and expectations and cultural differences played out for you.
Yeah, definitely. So, so I moved to the US when I was about a year and a half, 2 years old. So pretty young. But my family's a very, traditional Muslim family. And so there was a lot of sort of those traditional kind of household rules and in how we dressed and how we interacted with members of the opposite sex and how we interacted with each other and ourselves and honestly expectations for the future, right? Not just in a career perspective, but even in a personal vein where it was a potential of the arranged marriage and all of that stuff. And that always used to kind of make me laugh because going to mosque, it was very much like, here are the boys you're going to marry, but you can't talk to them. And then you go to school and it's like, here are the boys you can interact with, but you can't marry any of them, right? And so it was kind of one of those big culture clashes there. However, what was interesting is, I respected what my parents gave up to move to the US for me, right? They had all of their family back home. And in my father, was recruited by the World Bank. He had an opportunity to come. He had a kid, and he said, "You know what? I want her to have as many educational opportunities and kind of get the life a good live a good life and not struggle." And so we moved to the U.S. And so I was very respectful of that. But I was also very enamored by this no holds barred, very kind of open culture that I was growing up in. And it was very hard to sort of meet both sides of the fence, right? And again, right, and a lot of times it's not very typical for a lot of Muslim women to be able to be focused on education. And my father and mother were very much, you're getting your degrees and we'll deal with everything else later. But what they dealt with a little bit, right, and I kind of trickled down to me was having relatives sort of joke around with my dad when I was going to get my master's degree and saying, well, why are you getting her a master's degree to cook and clean? Right. And have kids. And that was one of those things where like I overheard my dad sort of very much like putting his foot down and being like, yeah, that's not the way. That's not what's going to happen. She's going to go and stand up on her own 2 feet. Because he had seen members of his own family, unfortunately, right? Like married off young, their education stopped short. One of my uncles unfortunately passed early, and then his wife was sort of left to her own devices, and then what happens there, right? So he sort of took those learnings and from the things around him, and he didn't want that for me. But that communication bit, right, that you mentioned, it was very hard because you feel like an outsider in both areas. And so you end up with, what I think is commonly referred to as imposter syndrome. And then that carried on, I got to be honest, into my professional career as well, right? Because you're a woman in tech, or you're a leader over a certain area where you may not have necessarily been boots on the ground before. And you kind of feel like you kind of know what's going on and you know what you're supposed to be doing, but you're not 100% assimilated into that. And so I think that that's one of those things that I think sometimes is referred to too as like your inner dragon, right? Like that lack of confidence. So you get to this point where even though you might be good at something, you still hesitate because you don't know how others are going to perceive you. um, and so, I mean, I think that's something though that I can sort of sometimes take into conversations, and then like with this whole concept of like the different silos not talking to each other, like some of my own personal experiences, like I can stop and remember that and then go back and say, okay, what is it we can do to break down the barrier and actually figure out that like you don't have to pick one or the other, right? You can be both, and that actually makes you who you are and can make anything successful in the end.
Yeah, I honestly really relate to your story because much like yourself, I am also an immigrant. We actually moved when I was 11, so that whole communication side of the thing, like it's so interesting that you said that you felt like you were in two different worlds because that's exactly what it felt like, right? Like you're either in the Western world where, it's a completely different culture versus the Eastern world where family and your culture is so important, and it has so much there's so much value to it, right? Like your family just wants to consume you and say, hey, you're going to be with us, you're going to celebrate all the cultural holidays and all the family gatherings and everything that you do. And when
Sure.
your friends are out going to the movies, you're like, I'm gonna go pray. I
Yeah.
have to go do a thing.
Yeah.
And then when you get into the career, for me personally, I didn't really have anyone who was in the corporate environment. And so no one really gave me any perspective on how do you apply for jobs? How do you engage in a white collar environment? How do you build relationships? How do you network? How do you go find a mentor? And that's something that you just have to kind of like, I personally had to kind of learn on my own. But it's so great to hear that you had a similar experience and we've somehow ended up here together in this conversation where we're now able to be here. And that's all because you opened yourself up and you allowed people to come in and you allowed them to know who you were and ask them who they were, so then you could have an open and honest conversation, which is, I think, something that Tim and I have been trying to allude to this entire time, to say you have to understand the other person so that you can get to know them and realize that they are also human. And
Sure.
I'll say it again, you have more in common than that what divides us.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think the real beauty of life comes from different perspectives, from, seeing something, right? Why do we travel? It's because we want to see and experience something that is completely foreign to us, that we don't understand.
I like to sit
Um,
on a beach, man. What are you
and
talking about?
yet, in conversations, we
Yeah.
don't,
Right.
because we feel like we're personally invested to our ideas, and I might have to tolerate somebody else's view, but you said that we could be both, right? You said that we could
Yeah.
have a position essentially and still be curious about another's position, still respect or maybe even admire a position that we don't hold ourselves. Tell us about that, Samira. Tell us about where that's come into play in your life and like how that impacts a situation.
Sure. Well, I think some of that too is just, I think it's very easy to get defensive and then we sort of stop listening, right? So something that's so important just, in everyday life, let alone in product management or experience design and things like that, is all about active listening and really trying to understand what motivates another individual. And I think that oftentimes, like, you can reduce conflict, or you can sort of help just sort of figure out why there's tension or mistrust if you can just understand where another person's coming from. I know oftentimes, it's really easy to take our own bias and perspective and our own personal experiences and make assumptions about another person and how they must be feeling, or what they must be doing, right? And yet everyone does have their own kind of unique experience, right? Whether it's because you're a woman in tech, whether it's because you're a foreigner or an immigrant or a first generation person here. I mean, I got to be honest, like, I think I also, for a little while, right, and I hate to admit this, but, for the sake of honesty, there was a time when I almost found myself not necessarily wanting to hang out. And this was, early on in my career, being like, well, I don't want to only hang out with, people from India or Muslims or whatever, because I don't want a certain stereotype to be placed on me. I would only really hang out with other, Americanized Indian kids. So, the ones without the accent, the ones that, wore the shorter skirts and the tank tops, things like that. And it was okay. It wasn't a big deal, but not around my parents. And so it was just one of those things where, early on you feel that way, but then, over time, I realized that, you kind of have to connect sort of with your roots and then people that were there and understand how they may be feeling. And I know for me, it was the moment of just saying, like, you know what, you were in that space before and you were there when you were much younger. But this must be how your parents felt. So let's stop and identify with that. And then kind of turn that around, is you wouldn't want somebody to treat your parents that were kind of new to the country that way, why would you treat somebody else that way? And so really just being able to sort of, open up and just, again, right, like walk in another person's shoes and empathize. And I think that really, right, it helps, it translates into things that I have to do at work sometimes as well, right? As far as really understanding, what someone's trying to accomplish and why they're trying to accomplish it. But it starts with being an active listener and then asking questions, right? Not just, you hear something that's interesting and you're like, well, that's kind of cool. Well, why? Right. And you go on a tangent. And it's funny when I'm training UX researchers, I often tell people, like, don't be afraid to go off on a tangent that has nothing to do with the subject, because it's helping you understand behavior and motivation a little bit more. And that'll actually make you a much stronger researcher, because you can get very interesting insights into people's problems. Right. So
Yeah, it's really interesting because Keikishan and I have talked more than once on this podcast about the fact that to be innovative in global industry right now, you have to have multiple perspectives. You have to have competing ideas. You have to not only allow for, but you have to foster this kind of conflict to understand a broader picture. But yet in our interpersonal conversations at this point in society right now, you can't.
Right.
So how do we help people who feel caught, right? Because I feel caught. Well, actually, I don't feel caught because I don't give a crap. I'm just going to be me. And that's why I don't get any like people actually pushing back on me, because they're like, Tim is a lost cause. Tim is going to do Tim no matter what. But people that feel caught in, I want to understand, I want to be curious, I want to embrace the conflict, not like conflict, but the mental conflict of how do we understand and reconcile these types of things and just more fully appreciate them in a society that says, no, you're in a box, you are assigned a place, and that's where you will stay.
I think some of it just starts with being brave, right? And being able to admit that you don't, that you have a certain opinion and you want validation for it, or you hear something, or you want to offer it up. I mean, I remember back when there was a lot of sort of angst against the Muslim community, right? One of the things that I tried to do, and I think I may have, I remember I actually got it from, there's an Instagram and Facebook called The Secret Life of Muslims. There's been a show about it, right? And it's all about all the different types of Muslims and people who call themselves, fake Muslims sometimes, or, things like that. But it's a fascinating show. But one of the things that they did during that time is they offered an Ask a Muslim, right? And I was like, well, that's really interesting. And so I just sort of went to Facebook and posted, right, that I was like, some people may realize this, some people may not. This is, my family is this. Here are some stereotypes that exist. If you want to go to lunch, you want to go grab a drink, you want to go whatever and ask me some questions, like, reach out and contact me, right? And a couple people actually took me up on that offer, which I appreciated. And I kind of tried to make a little bit of a joke there too, where it's because, like, Muslims don't traditionally drink, but I do. I don't, necessarily follow all of the rituals, and so I said, I'll go grab a drink with you. And someone was like, yeah, I'd love to, and I didn't get a lot of open posts, which I thought was interesting on it. I got a bunch of private messages, but I offered that up. Right. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I will tell you, I took it one step further when I met with those individuals and they kind of asked me some questions and kind of really wanted to know. I took the opportunity to be like, well, help me, like, where are you from? Like, what are your beliefs? Help me understand a little bit more about you and why you, where did some of these stereotypes come from? So I think honestly, like, it just kind of has to start with ourselves. I think what you guys are doing here with the kindness games is an amazing first start, right? To say, like, we're just going to just get out there and have a conversation with people, and then post it and see kind of what spins from that. And I think the more people are willing to be vulnerable, put themselves out there, right, and admit to things that they have done in the past or thoughts they've had in the past and that they have changed, the more people will kind of get on the bandwagon and do it too. That's really the only thing I can think of.
Yeah.
It's just
And
someone's
I
got to
think
start, right?
And I think part of it is it's not just doing it once, right? It's not like, oh, I'm gonna go have this one conversation with
Right.
my one like brown friend, and that's like check, I've like got it done. No, it's like a change in lifestyle, right? It's like a change
Yeah.
in, it's a change in your mindset. It's a
Yeah.
change in the way that you behave as a person, the way that you start to think about people. They're
Mhm.
no longer just those people, like, oh, those people are like outside my community, and so I don't necessarily
Mhm.
need to know them. But really,
Sure.
it's our community. It's we are all in this together. And
Yeah.
the only way that you'll really realize what somebody else is going through, somebody else's struggles and pains are, is to have a
Mhm.
conversation with them and say, oh, okay, I understand, and now you understand, and now we can walk this path together as
Right.
a community. And now we can really help to heal the way that our society works, and we can move away the hatred and work
Mhm.
towards creating a more curious and aware society. Evolution, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, I think about my own kind of little family here too, is, I'm in a multicultural marriage, and my children, they come home from school, and they teach them about the different crayons and people's skin tones. And my two little girls are very fair skinned, and they have got light hair. And it's funny because they'll very, very innocently say, like, Mama, we're peach like daddy and you're brown. Right. And it's like, yes, but we're still a family. Right. And but some of it is that whole, okay, like, when are we going to move to that, past the point of the sort of that, the us versus them mentality, the blue hair, or not blue hair. I mean, you could have blue hair if you want. My daughter asked for orange hair last night when I was doing it, and I was like, "What? Why?" But it is right. It's the skin tone. It's the cultural things. It's the people are different, And again, right. I'm not no longer a like practicing Muslim, but I definitely very much believe in the traditions and the cultures and like the values that I was taught. My mom is practicing, and we're teaching our girls Arabic, and we're teaching them all about the prayers and things like that, so they can understand where they're from and kind of empathize with that. And then when they get to a certain age, if they're like, we don't believe or we don't want to, like, great, that is a choice you can make for yourself. And they've had those moments of, why doesn't daddy do this? But they've kind of, it's just, they're so little that it's just, this is all they know, this is what they're growing up with. And I think it's great that we're able to do that. I appreciate that my husband, while not religious himself, is like, I respect that you want our children to learn these things, and that's okay, because that'll make them more empathetic, kids as they're growing older.
More
So yeah,
understanding.
I totally get it.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
NPR moment.
Oh man. Oh man. I almost feel like this episode doesn't need an NPR moment because we've had such an incredible conversation. Like, I don't even want to take away from it because we have learned so much, and I feel like I've come so far as a person. So we're going to ask the NPR moment for today and say, tell us tell us how you, as a, like, not the three of us here, but our
Sure.
viewers, like, how have you as a person learned to be more appreciative or be more curious in your lives? What are some of the steps that you've taken to go on that journey of awareness and togetherness? Because we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
And today, that is our story. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to us. And we'll see you at the next one.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Samira.
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
having me. This was fun.
All right. Maybe we'll have a part 2. Who knows?
Who
I love it.
knows?